I remember, obviously, when the COVID broke out, there was something about me, maybe it was the rebel in me or whatever it was. I found it difficult to take it seriously. It was so extreme, so far-fetched. You were expecting a wooden cart to go down the road with a sort of somebody ringing a bell, go, bring out your dead, bring out your dead. But that didn't occur, and it was, yet the media maintained this pressure. You have to put yourself back to that time. We've forgotten Nightingale hospitals. Bodies will be burnt at the crematoriums, working 24/7. You'll be able to see the burning bodies illuminated from satellites in space. Volunteers required, and we've forgotten the absolute terror of it. The pro-vacciners, in my experience, are 10 times more fanatical than the anti-vacciners. Wow. I mean, they are absolutely fanatical. Tom must be vaccinated, no matter what. His mother was threatened with arrest. Yes. They were going to take Tom into care, probably to die if he was taken into care. They were the hardest, most brutal fanatics, and we were Luddites. There was also a series of extraordinary statements made by these TV doctors. I remember AstraZeneca, it's 100% safe, it's 100% effective. You will not go to hospital, you will not die, you will not transmit. Well, leaving aside all the inaccuracies and all those statements, they've removed AstraZeneca from the market, even the pharmaceutical companies. It's so dangerous.
I'm delighted to have with me today barrister Paul Diamond. Now, Paul, you've been a barrister for quite a considerable time, and you took on the case of Sarah and her son, known as Tom. This case was in the Court of Protection, and the state was trying to get the young man to be jabbed against his mother's wishes. And it's very admirable and noble of you to have taken that case on. Could you tell me, before we talk about that case, a little bit about yourself? What made you want to be a barrister?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, obviously, you go to university, school. I was always, I think I'd probably say, on the rebel side of life, and I think I did a few jobs and I got sacked summarily. So I remember my father coming to me saying he had a job you can't be sacked from because you're independent and you have something called tenancy. So the choice, I was quite young then, was put to me. My dad was very keen for me to be a barrister, but the choice was put to me. It's either journalist or barrister. My personal hopes were rock star or airline pilot, but anyway, my dad was very keen on me becoming a barrister, and it's quite a lot of extra work. You have to go to a sort of barrister school after you've got your law degree and or other degree, and then you've got to do something called a pupillage. And when I did it, that was quite onerous because it was totally unpaid. There was no provisions at all for payment. There are now, but then. There's always swings and roundabouts. Now the position has to be paid to be a pupil, but there are much fewer places. Whereas in my day, there were a lot more places because no one had to pay for anything and you just took your chances. But that meant you had to live at home with mum and dad there was quite a lot of living at home with mum and dad supporting you while you earned a living. And then I did the pupillage, I survived it, and then I got a tenancy, which was quite unusual in those days. It was tough. I'd always, though, wanted to do religious liberty law, which sounds a bit crazy, and it was totally unknown then. And my parents couldn't understand it. They wanted me to make lots of money and be commercial and be terribly sensible, like all parents want you to be. In religious liberty work was totally unheard of, but I don't know, how do you describe it? I felt I had a calling to it. And I remember I used to get, well, this is sort of, it was very difficult to find space to do it. It was totally unknown at the time, and I started taking an interest in it. And I have to say, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and Britain was totally stable and would have openly identified as a sort of Judeo-Christian or Christian state without any qualification in those days, and almost slightly proudly so. But I do remember I started reading it, started studying it in my spare time. It was difficult to do it because it only occurred religious liberty really in international law. So I had to sort of look up a lot of UN stuff, and there was a body called the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which most people may know as the Helsinki Agreements, and they dealt with Jewish individuals leaving Russia, but at least there was some religious input there, so I tend to read these documents. I remember once, well, there were two occasions, as I say what it's like. There was, I remember once there was this top floor at these old libraries in Cambridge which had all the international law and religious liberty, which were virtually unknown of. But nobody went up to the top floor. And I remember once going up to the top floor to do an evening of work, and it was absolutely terrifying. It was like a sort of Gothic, pitch black sort of witches' tavern. There's sort of virtually no light and some books covered with cobwebs. And I remember going in there and sort of studying there late at night because everybody thought I was mad doing this. And then when I was a young barrister, it was very difficult. There wasn't any work in it, and my clerks thought I was a fool and blah, blah. So the only time I could actually work, I remember I used to go in on the 26th of December, Boxing Day, and work through the sort of Christmas holidays in the sort of libraries of the chambers and stuff till the 3rd or 4th of January when people would return from work. And I remember always feeling very sorry for myself because I'd be there on sort of New Year's Eve, obviously totally friendless and girlfriendless, working away while I could hear parties swinging on the streets of London. But I put the time in, and I think a lot of people thought it was very easy, but probably I spent about 15 years on it, one way or t'other, as a young barrister. And then I became the barrister to the Keep Sunday Special campaign, which no one will remember, but that was great fun. And at the Keep Sunday Special campaign, we buried 32 bills, some governmental, some private members, to introduce Sunday trading. And I really cut my teeth there because I was very young, and there was sort of lots of European law and human rights law. And I had some of my early big cases. I had a few big cases in my time. And then I did become, for a number of years, a sort of religious liberty specialist, partly because I was probably the only person in the country that knew anything about it. But I had a number of quite big cases that people might remember. They were very controversial cases. So
the British Airways one, I remember, with the lady who was wearing the cross. Is that right?
Yeah, that was my sort of... I had a few before that in the press, but that was my big breakthrough case. So British Airways had a policy that you could wear a turban, a hijab, but you couldn't wear a cross the size of a penny round your neck, you know, the tradition, because that ruined the uniform in some unknown way. And it was actually a wonderful experience because it sort of went through into the media and it lasted ages and it became a cause célèbre of British religious liberty. So I did that case, and I did actually pass that case on to somebody else, but I did another cross case with that one to the European Court, and they were so it lasted years and years and years. And people, that's why it's in people's memory. I think it kicked off in about 2006, And then the cases and the associated cases on it, which I was doing, didn't get to the European Court till 2013 or something. So everybody thought I was a multi-millionaire. People, I have to disillusion everyone. It's sort of high value area, and I'd spent most of my time doing it non-commercially, pro bono, or it's been very rare to get a normal brief fee. And so it's been amazing fun, amazing. So I did the British Airways cross case. That was a very important one. I started that one off. I've done a case called Alfie Evans, which was an infant in Liverpool.
They wanted to turn off his life support machine.
That's right, and the Italian government intervened, and the Pope intervened and offered him medical treatment. I remember in the court I managed to talk the Italian Prime Minister into giving us his private air ambulance ready at takeoff from a northern Italian military base to fly to Liverpool, to Alderhay Hospital, to take this child back to the Italian hospital. I think also though that was the beginning of these very unjustifiable decisions. I'm jumping now from my religious liberty to sort of right to life case. It was a very unjustifiable decision that parents had no control over the fate of their children. Medical professionals did. It's one thing for a doctor in England to say the treatment was futile. It was another thing to say you'd prevent another doctor, could have been anywhere, happened to be in Italy, a Catholic Vatican doctor, cannot treat this child that he believes there is merit in treating. So it was a very unsatisfactory. I think the law's getting clarified, but it's sort of, I think it illustrates some of the arrogance of the medical profession. And I think one of the most alarming developments has been the lack of parental rights over their children, whether it's in a hospital situation or whether it's in a school situation where they're teaching sexuality education, where the parents can have no input on it, or whether it's, children are taken into hospital and parents can't get them out, as happened in Alfie Evans's case. And there's been incidences actually where parents have broken into hospitals to get their children out and then hunted down for breaking the law.
Yes. But I can't remember the details there was a case where a family took their child out of the UK. They got to Spain, I think. They ended up taking him further to the Czech Republic. And over here, they wanted to turn the life support machine off. That boy is still alive and well after treatment elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm aware of them. We relied on that case a bit in Alfie Evans, and you beg the judges sometimes to have a second opinion. I don't know. The trouble is, I think there's this crossover between worthwhile life and futile treatment. I don't know whether I was aware of that, and he certainly was living and well in the sense of living. Whether there was recovery or not is controversial, the extent of it. And that was also Alfie Evans. Doctors felt he could be treated. And part of the problem is these babies look very normal and seem to react very normally. So the parents are finding it, they don't accept these prognoses of sort of brain dead and this. All they see is a healthy child that they love. And then doctors are offered to treat them. And I think there is an issue of the sanctity of life. It wasn't worked out at all by the British courts. So I've had my fair run of interesting cases, both in the European courts and nationally. And so I think in a sense, Tom's case, that sort of fed into it, insofar as it was really, it was an adult child who was had some mental disabilities, and it turned into a case really on parental rights. So who decides whether someone's not? Is it the parents and the family, or is it the state? And what occurred in this case is, and people don't realise this, you have a disabled child, you look after that disabled child all your life, you care for it. What they don't realise is on midnight on their 18th birthday, in law it becomes an adult.
Yeah.
And you're entitled probably at that stage to drive down to the local petrol station, boot the child out and leave it on the tarmac and say nothing to do with me, Gov. It's an adult now and I've got no responsibilities. The state can look after it. Of course, that's not the reality. People look after it. And in Tom's case, a GP who'd never met Tom said he should be vaccinated regardless of what the parents perceived the needs, and the parents perceived he was particularly vulnerable, Tom. And so it became a sort of clash, who decides, and the state or the parents, and it's become very unwieldy, the power of the state. I mean, one of the sort of ironies is, I think, since the Human Rights Act was introduced in 1998, this won't surprise people, we've got less human rights and less values than we did before it.
Wow.
And it's been a total legal disaster, in my opinion. We ought to actually resile from the European Convention. But I mean, it won't surprise people that parental rights, as I've indicated, schools, hospitals, but parents have virtually no say at all anymore. You know, you can just look at free speech. You could say what you wanted in 97. Now we've got hate speech, offensive speech, you know, prohibited speech, blocked on social media, so people reporting on Tom's case or the risk of vaccine injury, they were often taken off these sites.
You can't have an open debate.
You can't have an open debate, and if you mention it, there's an atmosphere of fear. People will shut you down and aggressively attack you, almost with the sanction of the state, because what you're saying is so wicked. You can be shut down by threats of passive aggression or severe hostility levels. And I say that because actually there was more freedom in 97. Actually, I've got quite a funny story on that.
Oh, please.
Well, there was this lady called Baroness Younger. She's now deceased, and she was leader of the House of Lords. Okay. And Britain was a very terrifying place from about the 80s to the sort of early 90s. There were three, I used to say, terrifying women running the country. There was Margaret Thatcher as leader of the Commons. There was Baroness Younger as leader of the Lords. And then we had the Queen, and then all of them were absolutely no nonsense, and you better have everything ticked and correct. And I was instructed by the leader of the Lords, and the Baroness was leading the resistance to the Human Rights Act, believe it or not. And she said, they're going to attack religion. I understand you know something about religion. As I said, there weren't many barristers around who knew anything about it. And I said, well, I know a bit. She said, I want an opinion to give to all the members of Parliament on why this is going to be bad for religion. So I sort of wrote this opinion, and I believed it was generally going to be detrimental to the practice of religion to have the courts interfering on a sort of limitation European law basis. So I wrote something I thought, relatively intelligent and sensible. The phone rang. You're expected immediately at the House of Lords, leader's room. So you sort of, oh dear, you go round there, and you got to drubbing down. You got to make this stronger. You have no idea what the forces at work are. And I sort of thought, well, this is just politics. I can't play politics, but you didn't stand up to Mrs. Thatcher or Baroness Young in those days. You immediately went, yes, ma'am, you know. And so I wrote something as strong as I thought I could write. I was totally wrong. She was totally right and a visionary. If I'd thought that in literally 5 or 6 years from when that bill was passed, they would be cases I would be doing that you couldn't wear a cross at British Airways, but everything else, or parents couldn't adopt children if they didn't accept a 6-year-old child might be a homosexual, and accordingly had to sort of give undertakings, or little Alfie Evans would be denied treatment, or I started off doing a lot of hate speech crimes, so people couldn't say what they wanted to say because someone would be offended, and this whole debate arose that you would be provoking your own assault by exercising your free speech rights, and the duty of the police was to shut down the debate or protect the individual rather than protect the right to have free speech. Yes. And so it changed very rapidly, and the Human Rights Act has been extremely detrimental to people's freedoms, in my experience. But I think once they're damaged and lost, I'm not sure there's an easy way back. Yes. If that makes sense. Even I doubt it's going to be as simple as some people say, let's get rid of it, let's go back to what we had before, because I don't think people can remember what we had before. That's right. That's right. So there's going to be that. So
we've come a long way since then.
Exactly. So
presumably because you are so passionate about religious liberty and human rights as well, were you born a religious man, or did you find religion?
No, well, that's a good question. I actually come from a Jewish family, but my mother was brought up a Christian because of the war, so I was brought up a Christian with Jewish roots, if that makes sense. So I was always in the front line of religion, politics, social discussion. So there was a lot of discussion on that, and I sort of obviously developed in the church, and my friends came from it, but I had a lot of Jewish family members who thought I was insane, obviously. And so I was always in the heat, so it was always something very close to me, and I could never understand why people weren't interested in it. It was always a mystery to me. It's like the most important questions of life. And I loved religion, and I actually loved my religious practice because I came across so many religions. I came across Mormons, and Moonies, and I came across some very unpleasant religions, if you want to know the truth. And it was a fascinating eye-opener of how people are motivated, their passions, the life and death questions, and you realise there's no such thing as secular. And some of the most extreme religious fanatics I've met are secularists. It's a violent anti-religious religion in which they've obviously got, many of them have got issues with religion, which is violently outworked. But I have learned we've all got a belief system, so we've got to do it. So no, it was very personal to me. It was very real. I was always interested, read about it. So when I was studying, as I said, I sort of had to find time to do it, had to find my religious books, and it's been, I very much enjoyed it. I remember when I was at school, a couple of girls refused to speak to me. It very upset me because I rather liked them, I seem to remember from some thinking or something. And everyone was organising this holiday to some Greek island or something. And I was excluded from it because I would ruin the fun and I would be sort of too academic or reflective or religious. And so everybody went off without me, which sort of very much upset me. And then I sort of said, well, I'm going to do something on my own then. And they said, so everyone said to me, where did you go? And I said, I went to Salt Lake City on my own. They said, well, why did you go to Utah? I mean, what's it? In those days, it was totally insane. But I said, I wanted to see the Mormon temple. So I sort of flew to the capital of Mormonism, and sort of that's how sort of bizarre I was. That was my idea of a holiday. Yes. And I remember going into the Mormon temple and sort of, they had their fair share of tourists then. It's a long time ago, but sort of an English tourist sort of flying in to see their temple. I became a bit of a sort of they were quite welcoming. Let's put it that way. And no, I've had some, and then I actually bizarrely got very fond of the Mormons. And when I became a religious liberty expert, I remember them inviting me back to give a lecture at their Brigham Young University, and then I was given an invitation to have lunch with the Mormon prophet. And it's at that place called their headquarters, the Hotel Utah. So I remember sort of going along to the Hotel Utah, and then the fifth floor is where the sort of executives all live, and they invited me up to the fifth floor. When I said I had lunch with him, I shook hands with him. He gave me a signed copy of his book, and it was quite a large lunch. I mean, there were about 100 people turned up to it, and I was at the table turned left by the window. But apparently it was quite an honour to be there. And then I remember about 2 months later, I had a knock at the door, and there were two young men in front of my door with their big badges, Elder Smith and Elder Jones. And they said, they do the usual sort of Mormon thing. It's actually quite a weird religion, actually. I love the Mormons. I love them. But their religion, theologically, is a lot more complex and challenging than a sort of simple Christian derivative.
What drew you to the faith of the Mormons?
It wasn't drawn. I think I'm just giving you an example.
Yes. To travel there.
Well, I think that's what I was just saying. I was fascinated in religion. I had some very unpleasant experiences as well. I used to go to certain religious gatherings. I went to the Davidians as well in Texas. Do you remember the compound at, where was it again?
Not in Texas.
Yeah, Texas, the one that
Waco.
Bill Clinton, Waco.
Yes.
So I went to Waco, and I remember going down the boulevard. I was very fascinated in religion. I'm not a favour of the Davidians either, the Wacos, but I remember going there, finding out about them, met one of their believers when I was there. Still alive. I mean, the shootout was in '93. I think I went there in about '06, and there was a man. I think there's something like 56 trees, for one tree planted for each of the children killed when the U.S. forces went in and pulled the wall down on the children. I don't know if people remember this. But so I went there to see the memorial and meet people. And there was a man tending the trees, and I went up to him, and he was he knew David Koresh. I think that's his name. And so I'm not fascinated in these sort of, let's say, in the religion as such. I'm fascinated in all the religions, and I've enjoyed going to Jerusalem. I've enjoyed going to Rome, and I've always taken an interest. That was just my thing, and I think, but I've expanded now since that was a sort of my young barrister days. I've gone more into free speech recently. I've gone more into, I'm trying to think with a case I've got a couple of national security cases on now, so that's very challenging, national security.
How did you come to find out about Sarah and Tom? How did you come into this realm?
Well, as I said, I think I'm not. I don't want to sort of put people on or off, whatever the word is. I remember obviously when the COVID broke out, there was something about me, maybe it was the rebel in me or whatever it was, I found it difficult to take it seriously. It was so extreme, so far-fetched. You were expecting a wooden cart to go down the road with sort of somebody ringing a bell, go, bring out your dead, bring out your dead. But that didn't occur, and it was, yet the media maintained this pressure. And this was before it even broke. I mentioned the day before the lockdown, a friend rang me up and said, let's meet in a restaurant. So we live in Cambridge, so we met at this central Cambridge restaurant. It was totally empty. We were the only two people there apart from a waiter, and it's normally packed. And the waiter said, what are you doing here? And I said, we're here for lunch. And then my friend and me hugged each other, and we both said, what a load of rubbish it all is. And my friend totally agreed with me. So we sat down, had a meal. The waiter said, when you leave, I'm shutting the restaurant. And then the lockdown began. So I had very early on problems with the message being given, the extremity of the message, and the contradictions of the message. And I assumed, I think, when it began, that it was something that might affect elderly folk, if I could put it that way, and they may need special protection. But I saw no reason why anybody moderately healthy should be affected by it. And so my wife is a health fanatic, a homeopathist, and she said, we're not putting anything in our bodies, she said to me, that isn't safe, and you need it. And we both decided not to be vaccinated, the whole family. I don't think we ever joined. I mean, I haven't enjoyed some of the conspiracy stuff, but there's definitely, I was shocked at the lack of debate. I'm a free speech barrister.
Yes.
There was a debate to be had.
For sure, yes.
And people were just shut off the TV screens, locked out of Facebook. Everybody was fact-checked. The algorithms, you couldn't even find anything out. It was for free speech specialists who worked with Soviet dissidents in his early practice. And they used to tell me what sort of the Brezhnev era was like in the Soviet Union. And that's what the Brezhnev era was like. If you want to, you want to know what it's like. It was very disturbing. So I was always at the fringes of dissent in that. And I think it was very hard. I mean, I lost a lot of my practice during that period. And I think there was a time I was wondering how much longer it could go on. It seemed to be getting worse and worse.
Yes, because they said 2 weeks initially to flatten this curve and just to protect the NHS for 2 weeks so that we didn't become overwhelmed. And then here we were, I think, in July, and still we were locked down for nearly 4 months later.
Well, I sort of remember in sort of 2022, in April, they were talking about you can't use the trains. And then all of a sudden, about 1st of May, it just stopped. You can fly again. As long as you wear a mask on the plane, you're allowed on, but you don't have to be vaccinated anymore. They just stopped it. Yes. And it was, so it was all very strange.
Very strange.
And if you think back to the time, because I've started doing cases like, I've just recently been defending Dr. Cartland at the General Medical Council, and I've started doing certain of these cases because I believe in freedom and standing up. Yes. As part of my general freedom practice. It's not sort of dead. You have to put yourself back to that time. We've forgotten Nightingale hospitals. Bodies will be burnt at the crematoriums, working 24/7. You'll be able to see the burning bodies illuminated from satellites in space. Nightingale hospitals opened up. Volunteers required, and we've forgotten the absolute terror of it. But
yes, and we know that the behaviour psychologists working overtime for the government were openly saying that we've got to ramp up the fear, we've got to make the personal threat greater.
I mean, the funny thing was, we had the most unappealing, unattractive Secretary of State for Health. what's his name again?
Hancock.
Hancock. I mean, he was a totally young man, obviously knew nothing about vaccines or medical issues, seemed to be totally, from my observation, self-promoting at every option, crying when the vaccine was introduced and sort of having an affair when all this was going on. I mean, it's incredible. And when these tapes came out, he said, scare the pants off them.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of Secretary of State is that?
Yeah.
And so it was very, none of it made sense. And then, I don't know, we had a Prime Minister who was initially not going to lock down, Boris Johnson, and then all of a sudden switched.
Overnight.
And everybody thinks, and most people now agree the lockdown was an economic and social disaster. And one of the most incredible things is that countries that didn't lock down, whether it's the state of Florida or the nation state of Sweden, have got healthier statistics than the countries that did go into it.
And many people were warning in advance of the potential folly of going down this route, I think. A lot of people were speaking out against the warning about the potential damage that the lockdown would cause. But again, the debate was shut down.
The debate was shut down.
Some very prominent figures. You had Peter Hitchens, the journalist, speaking out. Professor Carl Hennigan from Oxford University as well, speaking out. Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. So a lot of prominent people.
No, and there was also a series of extraordinary statements made by these TV doctors. I remember AstraZeneca, it's 100% safe, it's 100% effective. You will not go to hospital, you will not die, you will not transmit. Well, leaving aside all the inaccuracies and all those statements, they've removed AstraZeneca from the market, even the pharmaceutical companies. It's so dangerous. So, I mean, what was possessing people to go along with this narrative? And they'll say, well, we didn't know, and that was we were told at the time, and that was the consent. Well, what kind of talk is that? You're meant to be a doctor, you're saying it's this. Well, not everybody's a virologist or an immunologist, we know that, but you've got to have some satisfaction. And, you know, some GPs simply said, I'm not doing it, it's not verified enough, and it's not been tested enough.
Yes, there were some.
And they had a lot of trouble.
Yeah, some people did have the courage to stand up and be counted. How about in your profession, when you were talking to colleagues, did you find others in private perhaps more supportive of your own views? Or
I think, like all things in life, you tend to congregate with people that think similarly to you. So that it's maybe this survival. I mean, I had quite an unusual practice because I think, just saying this, when I started doing religious liberty, I started out doing hate speech. That was my forte for a couple of years. And by the way, I used to practice a lot in hate speech. And after all these years, I haven't got the foggiest idea what it means, other than the fact we disagree with what you're saying and we're not going to let you say it. But apart from that, it has no meaning, very little meaning, you know. But I remember I started doing this and it brought great embarrassment to my colleagues and to Chambers. And that was about 2003. So I suddenly got some cut off from colleagues and thought of as a general weirdo. And I also sort of worked from home a lot. And then of course, you meet other religious liberty barristers or people interested in it and free speech issues, and you congregate. So this actually did occur when I was mainly working at home. I've gone back into Chambers, but I think, I think people know what I believe because I've done the cases. I've done Tom's case, I've done another one, I do Dr. Cartland, I've been involved. I think what I would say is two comments on it. First is that the pro-vacciners, in my experience, are 10 times more fanatical than the anti-vacciners. Wow. I mean, they are absolutely fanatical. Tom must be vaccinated, no matter what. His mother was threatened with arrest.
Yes.
His mother was they were going to take Tom into care, probably to die if he was taken into care. They were the hardest, most brutal fanatics, and we were Luddites, and you know, they're prepared to destroy lives, careers. Absolutely fanatic, the pro-vaxxers.
Where does this come from? That's this sort of, it's hard to understand when you're not of that persuasion. You know?
It is. I think there were. Well, one is I made the comment earlier. People aren't without a religion. You know, you can have a formal Orthodox religion, Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, whatever it is. But you're not without it. And some of them, as I said, the most violent religious practitioners I've met have been secularists. And there is something about this vaccine. It became a central identity. I mean, people used to joke about it. Before they had the vaccine, somebody was quite normal. Then they got vaccinated and they were terribly offended that you hadn't got vaccinated. Yes. That, you know, and you used to go, well, it's not, what's your beef? Yes. You're protected, so why are you worried I'm not? And they got very worked up about it.
Yes, it became a very cultish, very ritualised, isn't it? Because you had to always sanitise your hands like you might do in religion in a way, and you had to wear a mask, which is like the symbol, like some religions force. It reminded me a little bit of the Taliban forcing the poor women in Afghanistan to wear the full burqa and things like that. You know, you have to wear the mask. It wasn't really for
We are socially engineered beings, and I am as well, and you are. We may just be slightly further down on the equation from other people, but everybody's on this equation. Yes. And whether it's, you know, I used to do the Soviet dissidents, but I remember I was talking to one of my Soviet dissident clients. I'm sort of jumping around a bit. Sure. He'd been in the gulags, he'd been everywhere, and he tells me he goes to the Vienna Opera House one night. You know, and he's sitting in the Vienna Opera House and he looks up at one of the boxes, which are extremely expensive, and he recognises a Politburo member of the Polish Communist Party sitting there enjoying the Viennese opera. So when they all get their booze at lunchtime, he goes up to him, he goes, I recognise you. And he goes, I recognise you. And he goes, what are you up to now? Now the Politburo's, you know, Poland's now a capitalist state. And he goes, I'm a businessman now. So he goes, you've gone from a Marxist-Leninist, he says, to a businessman, and a very wealthy businessman by the looks of things. Yeah. And this person looks at him and said, there wasn't one person on the Polish Politburo that believed in Marxist-Leninism. That's what he told him. Wow. And their conversation ended at that point. And these are very frightening conversations, because you will find that the people who voted people to their death set up gulags, concentration camps. It's the banality of evil. Most people are concerned about the pension and the holiday. If you talk to most German concentration camp guards, they'd say, why did you do the job? Did you hate the Jews? They go, no, the pay was slightly better. And we got longer holidays. You know, that's the human nature. Yes. And I think we go along, and you couldn't travel. Yes. You couldn't, you know, do your job. Sure. You were excluded from restaurants. Yeah. I mean, some countries were very bad. I mean, England actually was a liberal country. I mean, I had a French friend, and you couldn't go into a restaurant without some card. And it was, and he was in a very rural part of France. And I remember saying, well, they can't be that serious there. And he goes, they are.
Well, even in rural France, Yes, it wasn't so bad here. It felt like it was a lot worse, perhaps even in Wales and Scotland.
Yeah.
There were places here that were experimenting in a terrible way. So you had they were making examples of certain places like the Royal Opera House. You couldn't go in there. Yeah. Or to watch Wimbledon. Yeah. A few places. I was very surprised. I used to go to the Prince Charles Cinema. I thought it was a very independent cinema and would be standing up for liberty, but they succumbed and actually demanded that you had to have a jab to enter.
I had an Italian friend. He lives on this very remote island in Italy. So, I know, the people live in beautiful islands in Italy. And he was on this island. And he said he was there, he was having his cup of coffee, and he said everyone was queuing up for the vaccine. the person died, a 28-year-old, he said, got the jab, collapsed in front of everybody. They bundled the body off to the side. The person became deceased. He said the queue just kept going. No one, they saw a body lying there. The person behind saw someone collapse in front of them. But he said they just kept on queuing. It was the thing to do.
Wow.
You know.
It's horrendous, sorry.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I remember him telling me it.
Going back to Tom's case, I mean, I'm just thinking from, as a parent, and, you know, you think of your mother, you think of Sarah, Tom's mother, and she's nurtured, brought up this child from birth, has given birth to this child. This is a very sacred relationship. And I'm sure, I read about that case, and I'm sure that the state earlier on had, or parts of the state had declared that, you know, this child would have maybe a year to live. I think it was a trisomy condition. And yet here was the loving mother nurturing and taking care of this child every single day of her life. And the child is now a young adult, 22 years old, and yet the state seems to always wanted to interfere in this case again, even though the mother had, you know, taken such great care. We can't begin to imagine all that love and affection that a mother can give. And it's so difficult to understand how a state apparatus can come in like that and then...
Well, the state apparatus, as we said, is too big. Individual rights are being crushed, and actually it's gone backwards since the Human Rights Act. Parental rights, the state is deciding, and the judges, and the Americans have a word for it, they call it the philosopher judge, and actually they mean that in a derogatory term. Judges aren't philosophers, their logic is extremely poor, their beliefs in philosophy, they wouldn't get past the first year in most undergraduate courses, but they give these pronouncements on directions of society and the wonders of human rights, and there's a derogatory term called the philosopher judge. But we have these very difficult situations where children are often born with severe disabilities, and in Tom's case, you don't normally live beyond a year, and I think he's 25 now. But the doctors don't really want to treat them, they want them dead, they think the life is worthless. You have to fight for your child if it's born with a disability. So that was part of the problem, and I think they were amazed how well the child gave. And I think for a lot of people, it's very difficult to understand human love, compassion, dedication to a disabled human being. They're very sort of, it is a love you have to have, but people love their parents who are decrepit, they love their children, no matter what their state is, and they get great richness out of it.
They're very affectionate. I mean, I've had the privilege to meet Tom and others as well who have these trisomy conditions, and they're so affectionate, and they make you feel something about yourself, you know. Even
well, I think I heard the mental age was probably 2 years old, but I don't think there's a parent in the land who wouldn't love their two-year-old child and get a lot of warmth out of it and relationship with it.
How are these people so detached, then it feels? I mean,
well, people are detached. We're under great strain. Our religious foundation is going, cost. I mean, they're talking euthanasia now.
Yes.
A lot of it's just to save money, you know that. 80% or something of people's health cares in the last 2 years of their life. So there's issues like that. I mean, in the Tom's case, I thought I was quite clever for once. I did a play on Gillick competence.
Yes.
So there's been this great play of Gillick competence, and the Secretary of State for Education said children, I think as young as 11, are Gillick competent to choose the vaccine, and there's no need to discuss it with the parents. You may remember all that.
I have the letter, for my son and from where I work at school, yes.
Yeah, Well, Gillick competence doesn't actually say that, but it's an interesting spin on it. But I thought, well, let's take the government at their word. And what Gillick competence says, if you're old enough to make it, it was a girl, nothing as complex as vaccine and COVID, straightforward, a girl wanted sex, needed contraception. So 15-year-old girl knows what sex is, knows what contraception is. And they said, she's old enough to have sex at 15, is basically what they said, the court. And if she's competent enough to make these medical decisions, they called it about her health protection, she can get the contraceptive. So it was a very uncontroversial decision on something rather fundamental in life, sex, in which they use this word, if you've reached the age of competence, you don't need your parents' guidance. And so it's been this very complex decision has been run out as if, if you know what you want to do about a vaccine and your teacher's pushing it, you can get it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that would have withstood. I don't believe that would have withstood much in the courts. But nevertheless, they did do that. Shows you. But the interesting thing was, in Tom's case, we twisted that. So we said to the court, well, that's a Gillick decision. The Gillick decision says if you're competent enough to know your medical procedure, you can choose to have it. But if you're like Tom and you're never competent enough to have the knowledge of what the procedure is, it doesn't matter if you're 15, 13, 18 or 25, which Tom was, you never get competent, and the parents always have authority over you. And they did not like that, the courts and the government. I was twisting Gillick competence that for never parental rights would end, and they're not adults. And
reversing it.
I was reversing it. So that sort of caused a lot of sort of hoo-ha. And so that's what we were basically arguing, Gillick competence. We were also arguing some medical factors, and then we argued parental rights.
Yes. It seems almost like, I know that the outcome was the right one, of course, from an ethical point of view, from a humanitarian point of view, from the parents' point of view, above all from the mother's view. She stood in the way with your support as well, and the support of many others. But I think it almost still seems like when I was reading the documents about the case, it almost seemed like the judgment was made on the grounds that so many people had now been vaccinated in society that Tom himself would be protected in a way by all these other people. So they were still playing it in a different arena.
They were. I mean, I don't
Rather
know.
than
I've got to be somewhat delicate about this.
Yes,
we have very experienced judges. They know what's going on. They're very wise, they're intelligent. You may totally disagree with them, which we did, but they're gatekeepers as well. Now, the judge had a choice. He could find for us, and the government would appeal. He could find against us. State can give the vaccination to Tom. We would have appealed. This case had the stamp on it of controversy, going up through the courts, almost to the Supreme Court, possibly the European Court, with this saga going on and exposing the lack of parental rights, we would say, and the government would say the foolishness of people not obeying government guidance. And the judge's decision was terribly convenient. We won, but none of the controversial issues were particularly addressed on parental rights or vaccine issues. And it stopped it, because we'd obviously won and we didn't want to sort of reopen something. So there's a lot of play in that, if I'm making it sensible. I mean, it would have gone up to the upper courts.
Yes. But it's so nice to have ended this ordeal,
well, I
isn't
think
it?
it was in the press, because it's the first time any parent has prevailed. There's been hundreds of parent cases in the courts, and everyone has lost.
And they're very secretive.
They're very secretive. There are
lots
of them. There are lots of them people don't know. And this was the first one that won. That's why it was reported. And I think what people don't realise is, I think I said this, people want to knock out blow. They want to take the vaccine to court,
Yes.
prove it's not safe, they prove there's no virus, it'll be ruled. Well, firstly, I've done a lot of cases on free speech and religious liberty and other areas, national. There's no such thing as a knockout case. There's no such thing. Every case is on its facts and both sides adapt to the judgment, if that makes sense. So they try and neuter it in whichever side of the camp you're on.
Yeah.
Secondly, judges aren't doctors. They can't make these decisions. Thirdly, it's controversial. They're experts on both sides. So when you've got an expert on both sides, a judge can't decide. He can simply only say, if there's a reasonable body of medical opinions supporting the government, we have to support them as well.
That's a very powerful body as well.
It's a very powerful body. So that's why I've always been saying, need to take it sideways, focus on parental rights, focus on a human right aspect of the patient that's maybe a bit more individual, but you can win it like that. But I think if you go up the hill, you're like a First World War soldier going over the top, and there's going to be a lot of machine guns and no man's land to get across.
It's quite ironical because when you look at a lot of the government's own information, I remember finding out very soon after I think it was the 19th of March, I think it was, when the lockdowns started. And I remember seeing later, not so long after, that on the government website they downgraded this from being a high consequence infectious disease to something not so serious anymore. And yet they were giving a completely different message. I remember Professor Adam Finn saying that the evidence for this group, the ones with learning difficulty, was very weak. And I think there was even, in this case, I think there was a chap that, I think they tried to bring someone, Professor McCaffrey, who's a leading expert with this group, from America, who was a very learned chap and was saying that this actually could cause more harm. The mRNA vaccines could cause more harm to this group of people.
Well, especially if you've got a genetic disability and you're doing it with a gene therapy, it was a double whammy. But I think I sort of said the fanaticism of some of the pro-vax were, unflexible, as I said. There were threats to use the police and
shocking, isn't it?
It is shocking.
We have to say this is, you've compared it to times, I wasn't around at the time very much, but Brezhnev and, you read books about, sorry to have to compare this, but you read books from the early parts of the Nazi German regime, and we're sort of on the road to fascism.
Well, I think people know we're in a very dangerous time. I mean, whether they sort of whatever their particular concern is, but whether it's two-tier policing, and believe you me, there's two-tier policing, and I practice in that field. Whether it's the fear of speaking your mind on a whole range of issues, religious, sexuality, transgenderism, the consequences are terrifying. Yes. We've recently, I don't know if this played a factor in it, but you have, the American election, there's this constant media narrative that's bearing down on you.
Yes.
You have to go this way. Everybody else is fascist and evil. The world will end if you don't go this way. And people are getting fed up with it, I think.
Yes.
I think they're actually saying, and the media...
Very apathetic as well. People are not even voting.
I think it's very difficult, I think. I think people, the media is particularly atrocious at times and news distorting. And they're vicious. They're vicious. They don't want to. I've done cases and they try and destroy people.
Yeah, they're like the attack dogs.
Yeah, they are the attack dogs.
They are, yes, that's right. Another thing that came to my mind was that we soon discovered, again, come back to this Tom case because it really haunts me that I'm so pleased that the outcome, but it was so haunting and so frightening to just try to empathize with this family. But this group of people, the vaccine wasn't even tested on this cohort.
No.
Now, this is unbelievable. So this is completely...
Well, I think the vaccine had been tested on a lot of cohorts.
Yes.
I don't think it was ever tested on pregnant women and
No,
stuff.
there you go, yes.
I mean, it just rolled it out, made these assumptions. It's 100% safe and nothing to worry about. It hadn't been, but there wasn't any informed consent because most people have no idea. They turn up and a GP says it's safe. You assume they know what they're talking about.
A lot of the data was manipulated.
Yeah,
that's the,
but also the doctors seem to run with it with a flair at times.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the sad thing is there's another case now that's come up. The young man now is known as Adam.
Yeah.
And this was even, well, extremely shocking as well, because this time I read that this young man was actually sedated.
Yeah, but I'm actually doing that case.
Oh, okay.
And I'm doing that with a very excellent, very able solicitor called Stephen Jackson, who's down in Wales, and he's been a great support. Brilliant. He's brilliant. And so we're doing that case. And that actually was a follow-on actually from Tom, because she read Tom in the paper, and then she said,
it's raising awareness. It's so important.
Yeah.
And this poor young man was jabbed twice.
Yeah.
And I think someone compared it to Charles Walker. That Charles Walker, the MP, didn't have his jab because he didn't like needles. And I think it was the same for the case with Adam. But it's just like Adam's rights are being completely trashed. You know. And we're so quick to almost pass judgment on this group of people, but some of the things that they say and do, and they're so profound.
Well, you know what they say: a civilized society, you judge it by how it treats its weakest. I mean, there is something. I mean, I think people are aware. There does seem to be a sort of breaking of the sort of.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really, I didn't realise you were on that. I really wish and pray for this family and a good outcome, humane, because we've really lost, the ethics have gone, really sorry to say. Somewhere in the end, there seems to be, after some awful things, we get some humanity there. But it's just people are not accepting their responsibility or any of the culpability.
That's why people are worried. We're heading in this, we're abandoning our Judeo-Christian principles of autonomy and religious rights.
Sanctity of
one
life.
of the most shocking things in the ancient world, I'm talking about the ancient world, was that ancient Israel didn't expose children, and if you were disabled, they were cared for. Whereas in the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, the streets were full of babies exposed to death. And one of the early Christian missionary cults and hospital creations was caring for these exposed children who were rescued off the streets of the ancient world.
Yes, that's really good to know as well. That historically we had these great stories. It's been a real absolute pleasure to speak with you, Paul, and I really thank you for your candid and open time and responses to my questions, and to share this very important case and your whole overall experience and views.
Well, I hope it's some enlightening to some people. I hope that.
Yes, I'm sure it will be. Thank you. Thank you very much.